at 7 o'clock. Well, this program, television program, started in this country in 1986. Each year it is watched by over 3 million people on a fairly continual basis. It now has its own Facebook page, it has its own Twitter account, and it airs without commercial and without ending. I believe it has its own channel that you can actually watch it whenever you want. It was taken off the air in the year 2000. But because of a public outcry, it was placed back on the air the very next year, and it is now a staple of many people's holiday traditions. I am, of course, talking about Shaw Channel's Fire Log. You know what that is? Have you watched that? It's riveting, isn't it? The history of Shaw's Fire Log is quite amazing. What is more amazing is the interpretations that you can find about this log. People question, who has the mysterious hand that stokes the fire every now and then? People, and I'm not making this up, people have even argued that the entire program is a metaphor for the hand of God upon our lives. I don't think that's true. I don't think that's the intent of Shaw's Fire Log program, although that is the image that Paul uses in our epistle reading this morning. Paul encourages Timothy in his life of faith. He encourages him to fan into flame the gifts of God within him. It's the call for Timothy to set his faith ablaze, to make it a consuming force in his own life, and a powerful force which transfers to other people. Like a burning flame, Paul encourages Timothy with the word that his faith is to be one of boldness and confidence, and that he is to cultivate the faith so that he may uncover God's purpose for him. The image of a flame that is powerful and consuming, I think, is a call for us all. We are all called to acknowledge the gifts that God has given us and to manifest them in boldness. Like a rampant fire, we are called to let our faith loose in this world and in our lives. And so I invite you to pick up your pew Bibles and turn to the book of 2 Timothy. We are going to be starting, 2 Timothy's in kind of midway through the New Testament. If you find Hebrews, which is a little bit of a bigger book, you're going to need to kind of go back, turn left, kind of go back towards the Gospels. All the T books are together, so Thessalonians, Timothy, and Titus. So if you find one of the T books, it'll be around in that area. We are starting a 5-week series where we're going to look at the book of 2 Timothy. Often in the regular course of our readings, in our lectionary-based format, we kind of skip around a whole lot. And we never really spend a whole lot of time on one particular book. And if we do, we'll read a little bit of chapter 1, and then we'll read a little bit of chapter 2, and then we might skip to chapter 4 and 5, but we don't get to see it as a whole, and how Paul's thoughts progress throughout the entire letter. And so 2 Timothy will be our focus for the next couple of weeks. This letter is probably one of Paul's last letters, if not the last letter that he wrote. Paul is in prison at this point. He's looking forward to the end of his life. He knows that death is on the imminent horizon for him, and so his ministry is about to come to a close. And because of that, he writes to Timothy to encourage him in his faith. Paul has a fondness for Timothy. And I think it's because Timothy signifies a new generation of people who will proclaim the reality of Jesus. So in verse 5, Paul writes, I have been reminded of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now lives in you. There's a sense by which Timothy has inherited the faith that has been passed down to him It's kind of reminiscent of Paul. Paul says, I thank God whom I serve as my forefathers did. There's a sense for which Timothy echoes the manner in which Paul had received a history and a lineage of faith that has been passed down to him. Timothy is very much that same way. Yet this faith that has been passed down, a faith that is merely inherited from mothers and grandmothers, as sincere as it might be, cannot remain just a faith of inheritance. For this reason, Paul writes, I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God which is in you. Let me ask you a question. If you had to use the standard of fire, how would you rate God's presence in your life? Is it a match? It's lit, but it's kind of small. Is it a fireplace? It generates a good amount of heat, a good amount of fire, but it is contained and it's regulated. And if it's like a modern day fireplace, you can switch it off whenever you want. Or is it a fire which is let loose? A fire that continually grows and continually consumes. God's presence in our lives is to be a force which ignites all other areas of life. In verse 1, Paul mentions that the promise of life in Christ Jesus, faith in Jesus, is about life. It's about the intricacy and the entirety of our lives. It's about allowing God's Spirit to be Lord of all those areas. And so Timothy and we are called to feed the fire of God's presence within us. For you, if God's presence, if your faith is a small match, what does it mean for you to allow that to grow? If God's presence in your life is imaged as a fireplace, which restrictions are you placing on God's movement in your life? And what will happen if you boldly allow those restrictions to fall away? God's Spirit within us and the gifts that God has given us, they are meant to be noticeable. It's meant to be seen in the various corners of our lives. Paul says, fan the flame. For God did not give us a spirit of timidity, but a spirit of power, of love, and self-discipline. Timothy is encouraged to give himself to God's leading and God's work. There's almost a sense of abandon here, as Timothy is encouraged to allow God to define his life. The word timidity means cowardice. It means retreat. It means running away. We are not to retreat from God's presence. We are not to retreat from the places where God calls us to exercise the gifts that God has given us. There's a modern-day paraphrase of the Bible which is called The Message. It's a contemporary paraphrase. And it puts this verse this way: God does not want us to be shy with his gifts, but bold and loving and sensible. And notice that power, love, and self-discipline, they all go hand in hand. We're not called to be brash or insensitive. We're not called to be religious bullies. But think about the gifts that God has given you. And ask yourself, are you using them boldly? Are you using them stridently, powerfully? Or are you using them shyly? Are the gifts that you have been given used to help others experience the love of God? Is it leading you into a deeper experience of God's presence? If not, take up Paul's encouragement. Fan the flame. Feed your faith. A flame needs things, it needs to be fed, it needs things to consume, it needs space to grow. We feed our faith through prayer and through worship.